Let's start planning a project. Before we dig in, let's think about what a plan is and why we need a project plan. Peter Drucker, one of the most famous management gurus, tells us what an action plan should look like. An action plan is a statement of intentions, but it is not a commitment. It is not a straitjacket. It is not intended to restrict our movement or to restrict the operation of our business. A plan is meant to be revised often and continuously. It should anticipate the need to be flexible, and it needs to have a system to allow us to measure how we're progressing against the plan. In addition, a plan has to become the basis for executive time management. It informs the way we plan the evolution of our executives and the time that they spend in the way they spend operating our business. A project plan is very specific, and it's going to include the following components. A project plan is going to include identifying the scope. What is the scope of our project? It is going to include a phase of identifying all the tasks, the dependencies among them, and the schedule, in order to ultimately come up with an actual duration and time frame for the completion of our project. As part of our plan, we're also going to be thinking about our resources and how many we need and when do we need them. We're going to be clarifying the trade-offs that we're going to be making in terms of cost, resources versus time. And finally, we're going to develop a robust and a useful risk management plan that will allow us to cope with changes in our future throughout the life of the project. One of the critical reasons why we plan projects is to help us bridge the gap between the initiation phase and the execution. The plan allows us to reflect on the objectives that we set and to realize whether they're even feasible. It also allows us to come up with ideas around how we plan to execute our project and what kind of mechanisms need to be in place. The project management office, how it's going to look like, where it's physically going to be located, what type of meetings will occur, how often. And the plan gives us some indication as to what is needed and when. What are the pressure points of the project, milestones that have to be hit, and how we can plan accordingly. Some of us like to plan for a long time. Individuals who plan their weddings typically take many, many months to plan that exciting event. Others prefer to plan for a shorter duration, over a shorter duration, and really rush into the execution. In general, there is no prescribed rule to tell you how long you should spend planning. But one of the most important factors is to realize that while you do plan, even if you've moved to the execution phase, and even if you want to progress the project, you might have to go back and amend your plan. The plan is only there to start the process off. It is a work in progress, and it is a continuous improvement on our expectations. And so, let's start planning. Before I even start, I just want to caution you. This step is probably the most neglected step in the entire process of planning a project. We rush too quickly to look at timing and Gantt charts. So I would like to ask you, next time you plan a project, start with what I'm about to describe. In order to scope the project properly, we often use a tool, or we recommend using a tool, called the work breakdown structure. It's a visual tool that's literally going to break down the project into working components. The power of the work breakdown structure is tremendous. Not only is it visual and it is detailed, but it allows us for an opportunity to really reflect on how and what is going to be part of our project. It's as simple as thinking about a hierarchy, from the high-level project to sub-project that it might include, to work packages and to actual activities and tasks. Sometimes it can get very messy and complex, but in the process of coming up with the list and even looking at the visuals, there is a huge amount of insight that we can gain around the nature of our project and and learn new aspects of it that we haven't thought of before. Let me take you through an example, and then at the end I'll reflect on what we've learned and some tips around how to come up with good work breakdown structures. Here's an example. Consider the project associated with manufacturing a new product, a new cold press organic juice, from an empty facility all the way to having it on the shelf in a supermarket. When we started the project and we start thinking about this project, There are many different aspects of it. We need to think about the facility. We need to think about the manufacturing process. We need to think about the recipe that goes into the product and getting certified. Listing these out, even on a blackboard in an old-fashioned sense, allows us to get a gauge of what exactly are we going to have to do over the next few months in order to get our product to where we would like it to be. Once we brainstorm, either in the form of a blackboard, sticky notes, or on a whiteboard, then we can use certain tools and software in order to organize these thoughts in a more accessible way. Here's a high level of the work breakdown structure for this specific Lumi juice plant example. At the high level, we see that the Lumi project will entail many different categories. Activities to do with packaging, activities related to the liquid itself, activities that are associated with the financing or the IT, the information technology that the plant will need in order to operate. Breaking it down even further to the level of the task itself, we can see that the project looks much bigger. And I know that you can't necessarily see the detail that is on the screen right now, but it does give you a sense of the bulk of the sheer number of activities that might be involved, which of the categories have more activities associated with them, and where we might need to think about cutting down some of our scope or adding certain activities, or maybe realizing that we neglected to think consciously around the bottling and the caps that have to be purchased and outsourced as part of our project. And so visualizing the project and looking at what the activities are and what is their nature helps us gain clarity on the exact scope of our project. Another example, and I'm warning you, as I flip this slide, you're going to be overwhelmed by the sheer number of activities, and you might not be able to read each and every task. This is an example of a project that had many different components, hundreds and hundreds of tasks, and listing them out, while it takes time and effort to do that exercise, is so valuable and useful because we gain an insight as to areas that might be repetitive, resources that might be needed in different domains, and activities that we might have not even realized were part of the scope of our project. Now, there are software tools that will allow you to automate and allow you to develop work breakdown structures fairly simply. But the process of going through the brainstorming process of going through and identifying what is part of our project and what we might want to leave out of this specific project is vital before we even start looking at the schedule. So a few tips when you think about a work breakdown structure. First, start messy. Start with something that you can easily amend, either by placing sticky notes on the board, reorganizing them. Use a team of people to brainstorm and work together with individuals, including those who are actually going to be doing the work, or your clients who you might need to deliver the product to, in order to make sure that the scope is well defined. Also, you can think about and find out more information about automated tools. Microsoft Project has a work breakdown structure ability within it. WBS Pro is another add-in that might be helpful for you as you start working on your work breakdown structure. Now, there is some guidance that we can use and some rules of thumb associated with how detailed we need to be. So I would tell you this. First, as you think about a work breakdown structure, each task at the end of your tree must be executed by a specific resource. Some like to think about the actual tasks taking no more than 10 to 20 days of work. I like to think about it as a proportion of the broader project. Each task in my big tree should be somewhere between 5 to 10% of the work. Now, if you can't get to the level of detail that is required, it implies that you might not be talking to the right people, and you might need to find out more information about the scope of your project. So the first step is coming up with our work breakdown structure. Now we know the scope of our project. The next step is to think about the dependencies among the actual activities. The dependencies will give us the logical flow of the project, and ultimately they will allow us to find out the duration of our project. So how do we think about the dependencies, and what might we visualize the dependencies among the activities? Well, in order to go through the basics, we're going to start with an example, and we're going to start with the work breakdown structure of a simplistic project, just to walk through how the dependencies might emerge. So here's an example. This is a startup project, and again, this is a simplistic high-level view of a project just to give us the basics. In this case, our startup project has the following activities. It has a creative step, a strategy, information technology, fundraising, marketing and sales, finance, and HR. So what is the dependency among them, and what is the sequence in which I can execute these specific activities? One useful way to think about the dependencies is in the form of a design matrix. The design matrix typically has the list of activities in the column and the list of the activities in the rows. And for instance, in the design matrix that we're looking at, we have the following. Task 4 is dependent on task 1. Similarly, we see from this design matrix that task 5 depends on task 1 and task 2. Task 6 depends on task 1 and task 2. Task 7 depends on 5 and 6. And finally, 8 depends on 4 and 6. Now there's a lot of information in this design matrix. First, we can easily spot whether we have circular relationships, meaning two tasks that are continuously dependent upon each other. That will imply that we're going to do some rework along the way. Also, from the design matrix, we can spot how complex a project is. If many of the activities are dependent on previous activities, there's going to be a lot of iteration, and our project is going to be more complex, and we will need to plan accordingly. Useful visual way to depict the dependencies. Some people prefer to see it in a table format, and so we can list for each activity the set of predecessors that it has. Similar information, but in a different way, different presentation. In this case, fundraising depends on the creative. What's important and what's helpful is as we look at these dependencies, we can get everyone's buy-in and support. The individuals who are going to execute these tasks can agree that indeed they depend on others before them. They can also make sure that they understand who depends on the output from their tasks in order to ensure a proper flow of the project activities. There's a third way to look at the dependencies, and it's probably my favorite way, and that is the network diagram. Again, a visual representation of our project and the flow of the information and the physical aspect of the tasks and the materials that we need to accomplish along the way. In this case, we see, once again, the same links exist in which creative feeds into marketing, sales, and fundraising. Now, you might notice in this network diagram that IT is left hanging. It doesn't depend on anything, nor does anything depend on it. But that is technically not exactly correct, because the project cannot be completed until the information technology is installed and operates properly. And so one recommendation that you should be thinking about is that as you look at your network diagram, make sure that at the end of the day, there are no hanging tasks. You have one endpoint for your project. In a similar fashion, you probably have one starting point that kicks everything off. And while I could do IT, strategy, and creative at the same time, they're all going to be dependent on the start of our project. And so we're going to add two nodes to our project, the start of the project and the end. And we no longer have any hanging tasks in our network diagram. Finally, as we think about our dependencies, there are different types of dependencies that we could think about. The most basic one, and the one that typically most people use, and I recommend using it, is a simple finish to start relationship. You need to finish task A in order to start task B. Typical example of that might be software development. You need to finish the coding most often in order to start the quality assurance. Another type of relationship, however, could be a finish to finish. Two tasks that need to finish together. During a wedding, the bride needs to get ready, and she needs to finish her preparation at the same time that she arrives, for instance, with the minister or the rabbi. In my case, the rabbi was late, and I finished sooner. Another type of relationship that we might see is a start to start. Two activities that might need to start and work simultaneously together. Typical examples are construction projects where we might need to cement and pave at the same time. And finally, a slightly more complex relationship might exist where we have a start implying a finish. We cannot technically finish an activity until we start the next. More confusing, but again, typically holds in the situation where we have physical materials and we need to hold together, for instance, a skeleton by starting another activity. So as you think about your project, work with the correct dependencies and find the visual that works best for you. Well, first, we scoped our project. How did we do this? We used a work breakdown structure. In the example of the startup project, this was the work breakdown structure that we came up with. A header task, a summary task, and 8 lower-level tasks. The next step in planning our project was to come up with the precedence relationship. Which tasks are dependent on others, and how are they dependent on them? We came up with the following list. We recognized that fundraising depended on the creative work, that marketing depended on the creative and developing a strategy, sales similarly depended on the creative and the strategy, finance depended on the marketing and the sales, and HR depended on the fundraising and on the sales. In order to now move on and establish how long our project will take, what is the schedule, and when is the completion date for our project, we need to think very carefully about the durations of each of the individual tasks. For instance, in the case of our startup example, we might think about the following, or we might come up with the following durations, estimations in weeks for each one of our tasks. We assume that creative might take us 5 weeks, strategy will take us 2 weeks to develop, the IT might take 4 weeks to put in place. Fundraising is a long activity that will take us 4 weeks, marketing will take us 5, sales will take us 2 weeks, and hopefully with finance and HR we will be done within 2 and 1 weeks. But actually thinking about these durations and coming up with these weekly estimates is not an easy task. It takes a lot of practice, and there are a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties when we come to think about our estimates. Let's list a few of those challenges that come up with thinking about the project activity durations. One of the most notorious struggles that individuals have when they think about how long a task will take in a project is something called Parkinson's Law, made publicly known by work by Cyril Parkinson in the 1950s. What Parkinson's Law tells us is that if we plan for an activity to take a certain amount of weeks, be sure that the work will fill up that entire duration. If we give somebody 4 weeks to complete their task, they will take the entire 4 weeks to complete our task. And so when we think about task durations, sometimes we might find ourselves asking or building upon historical patterns in which individuals used up the entire duration of the task, or the entire time that was allotted to them when they actually completed the task, as opposed to really knowing what the work required. A second challenge that probably most of you can sympathize with is a phenomenon known as the student syndrome. What the student syndrome says is that if I give you 4 weeks to complete a task, you are likely to not even start working on that task until the very last minute. Like students, we procrastinate, we postpone our work, and therefore, even if we think that a task might only take 2 days, but we give you 2 weeks to do it, you will actually only work towards the end of that duration. Again, it makes it harder for us to really get a good sense of how long a certain piece of work might need or might require when we plan up front. Individuals are notorious for being overconfident, and so if you ask them how long something will take them, they are likely to be very sure of themselves and actually report something that is probably shorter than it will turn out to be in reality. Other biases that individuals suffer from are anchoring and confirmation. If I ask you how long a task will take and I'll say, hey, will this following task take you 2 or 3 weeks? Well, I anchored you around those numbers, and you're not likely to suddenly tell me, oh, actually, you're way off. It's going to take me eight weeks to complete. And so by having a conversation, we sometimes anchor ourselves, and we sometimes like to confirm historical patterns. And so if we estimated a task in the past to take only 2 weeks, we might report that going forward. And so there are many challenges to coming up with proper task durations and estimates for what those durations will be, which of course is the underlying basis in coming up with an overall project duration. But let's for a moment assume that we did our due diligence and we spent some time correcting for these phenomena, and we came up with good individual task durations or estimates for the durations. Our network diagram might look like this. We have the exact same layout of our tasks. We have our start, we have our end, and we wrote underneath each one of the names of the tasks, we wrote the estimated duration that we came up with. 5 weeks for creative, 4 weeks for IT, similar to what we saw in the table format before. How long will this actual project take? From start to end, what is our expected completion date? Well, it might not be too hard to find the longest path. If we look at all the different combinations and look at all the different possible paths along the tree, we might be able to see that the longest it will take us will be a path that goes from the start, through the creative, through the sales, finance, to the end of the project. A total of 12 weeks. But imagine that you have a much more complex and a much larger project to analyze with millions of millions, maybe millions is an exaggeration, with hundreds of tasks and many, many combining paths. What will be your project duration? Are you going to sit down and list all the possible paths from start to finish to come up with the longest one? Let me introduce a systematic way that was developed in the 1950s that allows us to identify the project completion date, meaning how long the project will take, and will allow us to identify more information about our project that will turn out to be very useful as we think about our project and plan it properly. Follow me with the next few steps. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the project and we're going to schedule everything as soon as we can. We're going to work from left to right and think about when a task will start and when will it end if we schedule everything to start as soon as we can. Once we're completed and we've gone through our entire project from left to right, scheduling everything as soon as we can, we're going to come back from right to left. We're going to unravel everything and say, when is the latest everything could start? If everything had to be delayed, when would the latest be in order to not change our overall project duration? That will reveal a lot of crucial information for us. Let me take you through this. In order to do that, I'm going to change the pen and I'm going to work with our early start and our early finish. I'm going to work in an orange color. So if we start the project immediately, we can start at time 0. The start task we know is a dummy task, so it doesn't take us long, or it doesn't have any duration of its own, so it finishes at time 0. If we are at time 0, we can actually immediately start as soon as possible the IT task, the strategy, and the creative. So the 3 of these tasks can start as soon as possible at time 0. And on the left-hand side here, you see some indication as to what these numbers are. The top left, I'm writing the earliest start. Now, if the IT started at time 0, since it takes me 4 weeks to complete, the earliest I can finish it will be at time 4. Similarly, the task associated with the strategy, since it takes me 2 weeks to complete, it will end at time 2. And the creative, in a similar way, I can add 5 weeks, which is its duration, and I will end at time 5. Now, moving forward with our project, since I completed the strategy and the creative, I can start my marketing task. The 2 predecessors for marketing have actually completed. When have they been completed? Well, creative is the later of the 2, and so the earliest that my marketing task can start will be at time 5. Therefore, since it takes 2 weeks to complete, it will be finished at time 7. In a similar way, my sales activity can start at the earliest at time 5, and it will be completed at time 10. Finally, my fundraising only depends on my creative, and therefore it can start at time 5, and since it takes 4 weeks to complete, it will be finished by time 9. Moving along, we have 2 more tasks to complete in order to come up with our project completion time. Our finance task depends on marketing and on sales. Since sales is the later of the 2, the earliest my finance can start will be in week 10. Adding 2 weeks for its duration, it will be completed at time 12. The HR activities depend on sales and fundraising. They can too start at time 10, and it will be completed at time 11. And therefore, if I look now at my end task, my project completion, the earliest my project can be completed will be at time 12. 12 is the duration of my project if everything is scheduled as early as possible. So we've now found that it will take us 12 weeks, at the minimum, 12 weeks to complete this project. That is the longest path. That is the longest path in our project, in our network diagram. The next step is to actually unravel everything from right to left. We are going to go back in time and say, well, what is the latest we can start? How much can we push some of the activities and still not impact that total duration of 12 weeks? In order to do that, we're going to mark on the bottom of each one of our tasks the late start and the late finish. Let me walk you through the example, and in order to make it clear that we're talking now on late starts, I'm going to change my pen to a color blue. So we've completed the project after 12 weeks. This implies that at the very latest, the HR task will be finished, or we would not want it to finish past 12 weeks, which means that at the latest it would need to start at time 11, since it takes us 1 week to complete. Similarly, the finance, at the latest, we would want it to finish at time 12 in order to not postpone our entire project. And therefore, it would at the latest have to start at time 10. Moving back in our tree, we now know that the IT task, at the very latest, we would like it to finish at time 12, since all it's feeding into is our final completion of the project. And therefore, if at the very latest it were to start, that would have to be at time 8 in order for the 4 weeks to be completed on time. Moving back through our network, we see that the marketing task at the latest could finish at time 10. And therefore, at the very latest, it would have to start at 8. Our sales feeds into both HR and our finance activity. In order to ensure that it delivers what it needs to deliver to each one of those tasks, it must complete by 10, since the finance task is dependent upon it. And therefore, it had to start at week 5, at the very latest. Similarly, our fundraising at the very latest can finish at 11, and therefore it had to start at 7. Creative work, since it feeds into marketing, sales, and fundraising, must be completed by week 5 in order to support the sales activity, and therefore it would have had to start immediately at time 0. Strategy, however, since it feeds into marketing and sales, will have to again be completed at time 5, but therefore it could start at the very latest at time 3. And if we mark our start activity with 0, 0, since it's a dummy task to represent the start of the project, we have completed the entire set of calculations. We have early start times and we have late start times for each one of our activities. And what's so important is that this systematic approach of calculating early starts and early finishes, and then sweeping backwards calculating late finishes and late starts, what did it give us? What information can we learn from this? Well, what's interesting is that we see that for some of the activities, there is a gap, meaning that for some, not for all of our activities, does the early start equal the late start, or early finish equal the late finish. And in those cases where there is a gap between our early start and our late start, that is slack, meaning the task can move. More importantly, perhaps, is that for some of the tasks in our network, there is no slack. My early start equals my late start. These activities for which this is correct, for which this holds, in which our early start equals our late start, or similarly, our early finish equals our late finish, these are our critical activities. These activities, highlighted in red on my slide, are my critical path. They must start at the time that we designated to them. They must end at the time that we designated to them, otherwise there will be a delay to my project. The other activities in which there is slack, those activities will be our leverage. We can postpone starting them. We will discuss when we might want to do that and when we may not want to do that. However, it is critical to know that the critical activities and our critical path is what tells us and indicates to us when we're going to finish our project and what is our completion time and where we want to focus our attention in order to ensure that we meet our completion time. There's going to be other uses for the critical path activities as we move forward in how we plan and how we trade off cost versus time. And so, summarizing what we've learned about the critical path is the longest chain, the longest path of activities in our network. It is, sometimes people call it the make span. That's typically how it's referred to in academic literature. Any delay to any of those activities on our critical path will ensure a delay to your project completion time. It seemed a little bit tedious, and perhaps it took us a little while to walk through that network diagram. And of course, if a project is much bigger with many more tasks, it might take you even longer to calculate the early start and the early finish, the late start and the late finish, to identify your critical path and your project completion. The good news is that there are plenty of tools out there to help you come up with those calculations. And in fact, they're so good and they're well programmed that they will calculate the critical path for you. They will run through the calculations and identify the early start and the early finish, the late start and the late finish, depending on the precedence relations that you've defined. One of those tools is Microsoft Project. There are plenty more out there that we will mention throughout the course. Here, the screenshot that you're seeing on the screen is from MS Project for our specific example of the startup project. Here's another example. Of course, this is overwhelming in terms of the detail. I'm sure that you can't see that much on the screen. It just gives you a sense of how many tasks you can include in a project plan. And what I do think that you are able to see is that there is a red path highlighted in the Gantt chart in front of us. Those are the critical activities. That is the critical path. It is visual. It is accessible. And if you want to, you can zoom in and just focus on those critical paths. Most of the tools these days will allow you to filter and to focus your attention on those tasks that you know you have to complete on time in order to meet the project duration. Software tools will also allow you to automate and to look at the network diagram in a fairly accessible way and customize it to your liking. The screen in front of us takes the entire project that we've seen up here and presents it in the network diagram format. Check out some videos that I've prepared associated with how to execute on these steps in MS Project. The next step is to think about whether we want to schedule tasks as early as possible or as late as possible.